Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Aquinas' ethical system. So let us begin. Aquinas follows Aristotle. He knew the Nicomachean ethics. He accepted the main contours of the Nicomachean ethics and the many distinctions made within it, and he developed it in important ways. Especially, he blended a lot of the ideas with Christianity. And one of the concepts or notions that Aquinas introduces into the Aristotelian model that is not there is the idea of intention. And intention is going to play a key role in Aquinas' ethical thinking in a way that is not present in Aristotle. So the basic idea of intention, of basic Aquinas' basic idea of intention is the following: intention is a kind of act of will, so it's a voluntary kind of act, and it's an act regarding means to a natural purpose or natural end. So it's a very particular kind of voluntary action. It's an act of will, so it's the will that is doing the action here. But it's not just about anything. It's about a way, a means to attain a purpose, a goal, or an end that is natural, that humans naturally aimed at. And of course, the main example of that is happiness. We naturally aimed at happiness. We don't choose to aim at happiness. We don't even intend to aim at happiness. We naturally do. We intend different things, different courses of actions for the sake of this natural end, this purpose of human life, which is happiness. Um, and here's a cool observation that Aquinas makes. So this is a quote by Candido. Quote, some acts are good. They're intrinsically good. The kinds of acts that they are by nature intrinsically good. For example, almsgiving is one of them. Some other acts are intrinsically bad. By nature, the kinds of things that they're bad. And rape is an example of that. There are some other acts that are indifferent, that is neither good nor bad intrinsically, that is given the kind of thing that they are. And those are, for example, taking a country walk. Now, depending on the context, it might turn out that these indifferent are bad or good, kind of in the circumstances. If your wife is, struggling, she needs desperate medical care, and you're the only one who knows, and you decide to go on a country walk instead, and let her, perish or at least suffer terribly. In that circumstance, that otherwise indifferent action of taking a country walk, in that case, it would be bad, but it is the circumstance that make it bad. In Aquinas's way of thinking, there are some acts that are good, like regardless in any circumstance, they still have this value, this goodness. Almsgiving is one of them. There are others that are bad, that regardless of the context, regardless of the circumstance of action, they're bad, like rape. There's no circumstance in which rape is a good thing. It's always bad. The other, though, the indifferent, they may be good or may be bad depending on the circumstance, but in themselves, intrinsically, they're not the kinds of things that are bad. In other words, taking a country walk by itself is not bad. It is kind of the context that leads to the negligence of your wife in a particular case that makes it bad. But that's something the circumstances that in itself. So here's the basic idea for Aquinas. For an action to be morally good, that is the thing you want to do, um, it must belong to the class of actions that is not bad. In other words, it must be a good act, intrinsically good, or it must be an indifferent act. Um, that's one of the conditions. The second condition is that it must take place in appropriate circumstances. In my previous example about taking a walk, when your wife is suffering, it's a good example of that. The circumstances matter. They help shape whether or not you should do something. So even if it might be an indifferent act in itself, in general, it might not be in this particular case. So the circumstance matter. And the same applies for things that might otherwise be good. Arguably, humor is good, right? Making a joke, having a good time, that's a good thing. However, if you're before someone who's suffering, right? Again, your wife is struggling, she's suffering, she's in pain. In that context, making a joke is callous, is wrong. I mean, there's something very deficient about the circumstance in which you're doing an act that is not, in general, in itself, good. The circumstances matter for the act overall, whether or not I should do the act overall. And here's the third part, which is where the notion of intention plays a role. So it must be not a bad act, indifferent or good. It must be in the appropriate circumstances. The circumstances might not make it bad as well. and it must be done with a virtuous intention. The intention the agent has plays a role in whether or not the action, the full-fledged action, is a good one or a bad one, someone that we ought to take or not to take, someone that's conducive to virtue or vice. And so it's a pretty high bar for good action. And the kind of implication is that if any of these elements is missing, the act itself is bad or at least deficient in some important regard. So here are the some of the consequences. A bad intention can spoil a good act that is intrinsically good, like almsgiving out of vainglory, or my example of making a joke out of callousness to inflict more pain upon someone else. The bad intention makes the otherwise good act bad or overall bad. But also, a good intention does not redeem an act. It is just one of the ingredients in the whole story. So, like, even if you want to help the poor, yeah, helping the poor is great. It's a great intention. However, doing so via stealing someone else's property is not the best way of doing so. So, the act of stealing is not redeemed by the good intention they're going to use the thing you steal. Here's the final kind of strong demand and morality that Aquinas puts forth. We may not do anything that is intrinsically evil, that good may come out of it. So all of the categories in the that's a bad action are never permitted under any circumstance. And even if doing that intrinsically bad action would lead to some good, one is never permitted to intend, that is to use as means, to intend as means, that bad act for the sake of some other great good. So it has very strong constraints on the nature of moral behavior. So what makes an intention a good intention? Well, the intention is good if aimed at a particular kind of act which reason can approve of, like almsgiving, like making jokes, being humorous and things like that. How do we know that those are the right ones? Well, reason knows, right? Think about it. Use your reason well. When you use your reason well, you will identify cases in which the action is good, and that gives you one of the elements in the story here. However, we as humans are fallible. We can be mistaken. So sometimes we use a reason and we come to the conclusion, oh, making a joke is good. And then we try to do it in the kind of clumsy way. So sometimes we make mistakes, cognitive mistakes. Our reason is deficient, and yet we still think so. So what should we do in cases in which we have a wrong belief about what the course of action is good? Aquinas says that in those cases we should follow our reason, and he calls it conscience. We should follow our conscience, which is a part of reason. And even if it is mistaken, why? Because we don't know that it is mistaken, right? We're trying to reason well. I mean, if we knew that our belief was mistaken, it's no longer reason. Right now, it's stubbornness or something else. For it to be reason, it has to be the deployment of the faculty of thinking, trying to aim at truth. So if we are mistaken about a course of action being good or bad, and we don't know, of course, we're bound to do so. That bound to do so, that is, we should always follow our conscience, does not, however, guarantee that we're doing the right thing, right? We can, that's not excuse us when we end up doing the wrong thing out of mistake. And here's the example that Kenny gives us. While an error about a fact, a particular empirical fact, say whether a woman is married or not married to someone else, may, if not the result of negligence, excuse one from guilt if one engages in sexual activity with someone that happens to be married someone else and it's unbeknownst to one, that may not be a source of guilt or blame or even punishment for the person. Perhaps they've been doing it wrong. However, that's different from what Aquinas calls errors about divine law. And those are general claims about the nature of morality. Say whether or not adultery itself is bad. Uh, Aquinas thinks that the natural law is like the eternal truths of morality, and those reason is capable of knowing. And we would only not believe those things if we have neglected our use of reason properly. And for that, we're blameworthy. So we cannot justifiably believe something that is contrary to the divine law. And adultery, Aquinas thinks, is an example of this. But torturing innocent babies for fun, breaking promises for the sake of personal gain, all sorts of like this generally describe events that are obviously mistaken. They're enshrined in the divine law, which is the eternal truths of morality. And we have no excuse if we don't understand those. It's our fault, claims Aquinas, because we haven't spent enough time thinking about it. They're transparent to reason if we spend time thinking about it. So that notion of intention is going to be developed into a view that people are going to later call the principle or the law of double effect. And it's a way of making the very extreme demand of never do anything that is intrinsically bad. It's just a way of trying to diminish that a little. It's a way of creating a little bit more wiggle room for moral behavior. And the first observation is that foresight, that is knowing that something will happen as a consequence of your action, does not equal intention, right? Intention means that you will the thing as a means to your end, not that you foresee that it will happen and that it will come about. That's a different category. So we can foreknow unintended consequences of our actions. For example, when I drive to work, I intend to go to work, right? That is something I will. However, here's something that happens. The tires in my car are worn out as I use them, right? So there's this side effect, there's this consequence of my action of going to work, namely the tires get worn out. But I don't really intend that. I don't mean to do that, right? It's not my intention to do that. It just happens in my goal of coming to work that the tires are worked out. And that is a morally legitimate distinction, claims Aquinas. So here's a way of implementing the law. And again, the point is that there will be some known consequences that are evil or bad, intrinsically bad from our actions. And yet, in some cases, we will be morally justified in doing those actions. So here are the set of conditions that give rise to one being morally permitted in doing something that we know is going to lead to a bad or evil, intrinsically evil consequence. The first is that the act itself, the thing that I'm doing, must be morally good or at least indifferent. Going to work, for example, is morally good or perhaps at least indifferent. Two, the agent may not positively intend the bad effect. In other words, whatever comes about as a consequence is not something I intend to do. I permit it to happen because I foresee it as a consequence of my action, but I don't want it, I don't will it. In a way of trying to catch that out is that if I could do the good act that I'm trying to do without that consequence, I would and I should do that, right? It's not the consequence, it's not the wearing of the tires that I want. In fact, I want them not to worn out so I don't have to replace them. But I do it nonetheless. I drive to work nonetheless, not because I want the tire and the wearing of the tires, but because I foresee them and permit them to happen. And there's nothing I can do about it. Furthermore, the good action that I'm intending, the good goal, the thing that I'm aiming at, must be greater than the bad, unintended bad. So if I'm trying to bring about something good, I mean, that's my intention, and I can foresee this negative consequence. One of the conditions for me to be morally permissible to do this thing is that the thing that I'm intending is greater in value than the foreseen bad that will come about, so unintended bad that will come about. And here's a way of trying to make the distinction between foreseeing and intending. The good intended effect must be directly caused by the action, but the unintended bad effect must be a mere side effect and be more like distant from the action itself. And this is the shaky distinction, but it's a way of trying to make a distinction between willing and intending an act in just foreseeing it as a consequence, unintended consequence. And here's the example that Kenny gives us. Killing is self-defense. What is it that I'm doing when I'm, killing someone who's trying to attack me? I'm doing a sort of self-defense. Aquinas thinks that's fine. One can kill someone else out of self-defense. However, for one to do so morally, one must intend not to kill the other person, but to save one's life. The goal is to save one's life. And one can only justifiably kill the attacker if the attacker cannot be stopped otherwise, right? I'm not intending to kill the attacker. I'm just intending to save my life. And I'm only permitted to kill the attacker in self-defense if the only way of stopping this person is by killing them, right? If I can do something else to stop them, then I should do that. And this goes back to if I could avoid the consequence, I would and I should. And condition number two, it is not the death of the assailant, the person trying to attack me, that I want, that I intend. It's saving my life that I intend. If there will be another way of saving my life without killing them, then I should do that. And in that case, then killing self-defense will not be morally permissible. Uh, the general observation is that it is always impermissible to intend to kill another person. Like, that's always impermissible. However, there may be some times in which it is permissible to foresee the death of someone in the doing of something morally legitimate, like saving your own life. And if you intend to kill them, then even though you're engaged in self-defense, you're also doing something wrong because you shouldn't intend to kill them. If you don't intend to kill them, but they end up dying, and you know that they're going to die, right? Because you're shooting them or something, then you may be morally permissible, provided that all of the other conditions are in place. So the final thing I want to discuss is Aquinas' conception of true happiness and the way that relates to God. Again, Aquinas is building on Aristotle. So in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we have the development of the moral intellectual virtues as essential to human flourishing. And the culmination of the story is this kind of union with God, a union that is kind of contemplation, right? The highest part of humanity, the highest faculty is reason, and within reason, the highest activity is contemplation of the greatest good, which is God. And Aquinas is just going to borrow the whole picture, say, yep, that's the right picture. But the conception of God that Aquinas has is a very Christian conception. So it's not just contemplation as such, but a contemplation that gives rise to love. One is going to love God in heaven. That's part of the union with God. In Aquinas' God is a Christian God that looks back, that loves back. So it's a kind of loving relationship grounded in contemplation as the greatest activity of the intellect. But intertwined with that is enjoying the good, and the enjoying is an act of love. So Aristotle is going to try to bring those two stories together. And part of the Christian story is that entering heaven requires divine grace. And here's the way in which Aquinas tries to build that into his otherwise very Aristotelian story. The union with God requires divine grace, Aquinas is going to argue. Uh, it is humanly impossible to attain this kind of true happiness because it is supernatural union with God. For Aristotle, it is the natural culmination of human flourishing to have this contemplation of God. And that's just a natural process that one can do without God's aid. The crucial distinction for Aquinas is that God's assistance is necessary, and that's kind of built into human nature. Human nature kind of strives towards God, but is incapable of attaining God, is incapable of reaching the union with God unless God condescends and helps and comes down to us and aids our process. Um, so we don't have a natural capacity, says Aquinas, for this kind of supreme happiness. Uh, in Aristotle, we do, right? The natural capacities for the flourishing of not the human capacity. Um, for Aquinas, nature is kind of pointing to it wants to attain supreme happiness, which is union with God, but it lacks the natural capacity. Uh, Humans, however, have capacity to engage in freedom. So it is the freedom that allows humans to freely accept the divine graces that God gives us so that we can attain union with God. So it becomes this kind of shared action in which the human, by the use of his human freedom, accepts that divine grace, which enables him to grow in the right way for attaining union with God. The grow in the right way has to do with developing the theological virtues. So Aquinas thinks that humans can naturally develop the natural virtues like compassion, fortitude, courage, kindness. We can naturally do that on our own without divine grace, though grace can help there too, but it's not needed, it's not required. Uh, for the thing that the kind of human flourishing, if that's the right word, the development of the virtues that grace is absolutely required is the theological ones: faith, hope, and charity, which is a kind of love. It's a peculiar kind of love, which is divine love. And it is the development of those three basic theological virtues that require grace and that kind of prepare the human for the eternal union with God. It is kind of the flourishing, if that's the right word, of the individual and the development of these virtues, these theological virtues that enables them to be in union with God. And that's why grace is required. Grace is required for the development, not of the normal human virtues, but of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And here's the final observation, and this kind of blending of the Aristotelian story with the Christian elements. So, according to the Bible, moral action is the following of the laws given by God. Right? God is the legislator; He gives you laws. So you're a good person if you follow the laws of God. Right? This is a basic kind of moral arrangement. According to the Aristotelian model, on the other hand, moral action is acting in accordance with right reason. It's thinking, it's understanding the world as it is, and it is your unaided human reason that can tell right from wrong, and then you act on the basis of your reason. And Aquinas wants to have it both ways. And here's I mean, we've seen a little bit of that already. But he says that the way of noticing how there's no conflict here is that uh, divine laws, the laws that the Christian story has, we should follow as human beings to be good human beings, are the result of right reason. In other words, God gives the laws that he does because he uses reason correctly. God reasons about morality and gives us the right moral laws. And then we as human agents are endowed with reason as well. That's part of what we are made in the image and likeness of God. And we can by ourselves identify or understand these rules and then comply with them. So there's this overlap between the law of God, which is granted in divine reason, and a human capacity to understand moral action, which is itself granted a human reason, which is something that's related to God. Right? Human reason is an imitation or a resemblance or an image of the divine law, the divine reason. So there's no tension here. That's how both stories come together. Okay, I'll stop here. I'll see you next time. Bye.